Hey everyone, welcome back to another video. In this one, I'm going to be showing you how to build a stopwatch using Svelte and TailwindCSS. So if you see here, we have the application that we're going to try building together. And if you click on the start button, it's going to start the stopwatch. And then of course you can click pause to kind of pause its running time and then come back later and resume it. And then finally, if you're done and you've got your timings all stored or wherever you need to do with them, you can go ahead and click that reset button and it kind of resets it back to the initial state. So that is what we're going to be building, and if you're interested in following along, I definitely recommend watching through this whole tutorial because there's a lot of cool stuff we're going to be learning about Svelte and Tailwind CSS. Alright, so let's just go ahead and get started. I'm going to first start with writing the HTML and just style it with Tailwind. So in this app, let's just make a div, and we can give it a class of, let's say, h of screen, just to expand the div to the full height of the screen. And then we actually want to apply a background gradient. So I can say bg gradient to BR, and that'll make a gradient from the top right to the bottom right. And then I can give it some colors. So I can say BG, or I could say from blue of 500 and then to green of 400 or something like that. And then you can see we actually have a cool little gradient for our background. So inside of the main div, let's go ahead and add another div, and I'm going to call it class of glass. And that is going to basically be styled using the Svelte style tag down here. So inside of here, I'm just going to copy some style I already have created, just so that we can kind of show you glassmorphic design for this. But you're welcome to add this to your actual Tailwind config if you rather it be defined there. But I think it's okay to have some CSS with Tailwind. So inside of this component, let's also make this a width of maybe 2/3 of the page. And then also a height of maybe 60 and see how that looks. And let's make sure we add the ending slash here. All right, so you can see here we have a little div here, but unfortunately it's not centered, and I do think that the 34 might be a little bit too much. Let's do 32 for right now. And in the main wrapper class, let's just go ahead and add a flex to it. And I'm going to say flex column, and I'm also going to say justify content of center, so just like that. And that'll center that little panel in the middle of our page. And then also what we want to do is align it to the center of our page as well, horizontally, so I can say items center. So at this point, we have a cool little design, a cool little like overlay that looks kind of like glass. And now what we want to do is we probably want to add some type of title to it. So let me just go ahead and expand that closing div. And then we can add like an H1 and call it super stopwatch. Save that, and that'll show up here. And we could also do is let's add some buttons. So I'm going to say button. We're going to need a start button. We're going to need a reset button. And then we probably also want to pause and a resume. Now, when we get to writing the actual JavaScript, that's where we can conditionally hide and show these buttons based on the state of our stopwatch, but we'll dive into that a little bit later. Let's continue styling this out and building it up. So I'm going to say class onside the H1. Let's just make it the text a little bit bigger. So I can say text of 2XL and see how that looks. And that looks okay. Let's give it like a text of yellow of 200 and see how that looks. Maybe even 100. I think 100 looks pretty good. We can give it a border bottom, and then we could say border yellow of 200 as well. And that should hopefully, I'll do border B, not border bottom. And that should make it have a little line underneath it. That looks pretty good. In fact, maybe we want to do white here. Now on this entire glass div itself, let's add some padding. So I could do padding 12 and see how that looks. That's way too much, so maybe padding 4. That looks a lot better. So now we have these buttons that we need to style. But for right now, let's just style one and we can kind of apply the classes to all of them. So let's add a class to the start button. I'm going to make it border of white, and I'm going to make it border, and I'm going to make it rounded. So now we'll have a button that's rounded on the edges, and it has a white border, and then probably the text would need to be white as well. So if we add a text white class here, that'll be applied. Now what you'll notice as well is that we have more padding on the top and bottom than we do to the left and the right. So we can say padding of X, PX, and we can give it 4 and see how that looks. And that's a little too much, so let's go ahead and do that. Change it down to a 2, and then maybe the text should be a little bit larger. So at this point, we could probably apply that same style to all the other buttons as well. So doing the multi-select cursor, I will just do that. And now they all look pretty nice. Now the pause button should probably be a different color than the start and the resume, etc. So let's make the start button a nice green. So instead of doing text white and everything, let's do a green of like 200 and a border green of 200 and see how that looks. That looks pretty good. What we could also do is add some margin right to all these. So margin right of 2, just to space them out a little bit. And don't worry about this little resume button. We're only ever going to show maybe like 2 buttons on the page at once. So this will not be wrapped down to the next line. For the reset button, let's go ahead and make that red. So let's look for the reset button here, and we could say text. Oh, actually, we can go and find where we are doing text of white. We could say red of 200 and border red of 200 as well. And that'll make it look a little nicer. Maybe 500 might look a little more serious, right? We'll make the resume button black just so that we have something different. So I'll say text of black and border of black as well. So now we have 4 distinct buttons that the user can click to stop, start, reset, and pause the stopwatch. All right, so one thing you might notice is that we don't actually display the times anywhere. So underneath the H1, let's just add another. We could just do like a paragraph tag, but it really doesn't matter what you do. You could do a div if you want. But in here, we could just give it a text size of, we'll say XL and see how that looks. And we'll just say elapsed time, give it a colon, and then we'll just do some placeholder text for right now, just to make sure we know we're styling something that looks okay. So in that case, we should probably add some real timings here, right? All right, so that is what our stopwatch currently looks like. It'd probably be better if the text was white, so we could add that to it. And then some padding underneath this. So I'm going to say margin bottom, sorry, margin, not padding, just to bring down the elapsed time. And then secondly, we could add some padding, a margin to the elapsed time. And then finally, you'll notice on the glass div, we don't really have enough height. So let's try 36. And that looks like it should be pretty good. The only thing I would like to change is make this all aligned to the right. So all the buttons, we could potentially just wrap in something and say class of text right. And I think that should push them all to the right. And I'll restate one more time. Don't worry about this resume button. It's not going to be displaying with all these other buttons. So I think we have a pretty good looking stopwatch at this point. You have the nice gradient. You have a nice glassmorphic. Is that how you pronounce it? Glassmorphic styled panel here. You have a title and you have some elapsed time. So let's just go ahead and start writing out some JavaScript to actually make this functional. So one thing I'll mention is that I am actually using TypeScript for this tutorial, but we're not going to be using that much additional logic from TypeScript. So don't worry if you don't know how TypeScript works. But the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to declare an enum just so we can keep track of the state of our application. So you know how your state can be, so our stopwatch can be either in a running state, it could be in a pause state, it could be in a new state. So what we're going to do is make an enum here, and we're going to name it state. And inside of that enum, we can kind of define those. So I could say new, running, and paused. This is very similar to just having like integers that are hard coded to like numbers. But we're just going to be using this because it makes our life a little bit easier. And we're actually going to be keeping track of the current state of our stopwatch by just declaring another variable. So I could say let state of state equal to state.new. Oops, I can't type. So now we have a variable in which we can use in our template down here to conditionally show and conditionally hide different buttons. So let me just show you how that works. If I go down to the buttons down here, what do we want to show if the state is new? Well, we probably only want to show the start button, right? So what we could do is just put a condition here. And I will say curly brace hashtag if state is equal to state.new. Then we could just display that. Now in Svelte, this is how you conditionally render components. You notice that I have a starting block, and then underneath I have a ending block, and they're all really similar. Like you have if, and then I think you have like an each block you can use. So that is how you conditionally render stuff. And now if I save this, nothing changes on the panel because we actually are in the state of new. But if I were to change this to like paused and save it, you'll notice that the start button is no longer there. So we are making some progress. So let's go ahead and do the same logic for the other buttons. So the reset button should really only show up if we are currently running or if we are currently paused. So what I could say is running or state is state.paused. All right, now the pause button should really only show up if we are running. So let's just go ahead and get rid of that extra state here. Save that. And then finally, the resume button should only show up if we are currently paused. So state.paused. All right, so let's just go ahead and, I hope that all made sense. So basically all these buttons are going to show differently depending on the state of our stopwatch. And if I scroll back up to the top, it'll make sense to make this back to new. So I will do that. And now we have a stopwatch that we can click on a start button. Right now it doesn't do anything, so let's go ahead and start implementing that logic. So on the start button down here, we could add a Svelte event callback. So I can say on click, we can call a function. Now we haven't declared a function yet, but I'm going to pretend like we have one called clicked. And I'm going to go up here and just make a new function called clicked. And you know what? I'm actually going to rename that to start, because that would probably make a lot more sense. If you click on a button that says start, it calls a function that is also called start. So now that we call this start function, what we want to do is we want to kick off an interval to kind of keep track of some running time. So to do that, let's just go ahead and keep track of the start time here. And that could be a number. And then inside the start function, we could say start time is equal to date.now. And that'll basically allow us to keep track of when we started the timer. Secondly, we want to set an interval on the application so that we can keep on updating the time that we have displayed here. So we could say set interval and call that inside of a function, or pass that a function, I mean. And what we could do here is basically just keep track of the elapsed time. So let's pretend that we have another variable up here called elapsed time, and that could also be a number. And as the interval is going, if you don't know what an interval is, it's basically a function that keeps on getting called every so often. So I could make this called every second if I wanted to, but since the millisecond resolution is kind of important for our timer, we just want to call it as fast and often as possible. So now that we have an interval set up, what we could do is say elapsed time is equal to start time. Actually, it's going to be in time minus start time, okay? So in time we haven't declared yet, so we can say const in time is equal to date.now. And if you're not familiar with date.now, it just returns a number which represents the, I think the epoch time, or the number of milliseconds since some year, like 1950 or something. So that is what that represents. And if you take the difference between the in time and the start time, you'll get the elapsed time. Now, just to verify this is all working before we start adding more code, let's just see if we can print that out here. So instead of hard coding this, I am going to instead interpolate in Svelte that elapsed time variable. And now it's going to say undefined, but if I click start, notice that it goes up. So this is the number of milliseconds that have passed since the user has clicked the start time. Now, one thing you'll notice is that the start button still displays, and we actually want the pause and reset button to display. So to fix that, we can go up to our start function, and we could simply say state is equal to state of running. Okay, so now the app is actually running, and when we click that start button, the reset button shows up and the pause button shows up. Now, at this point, I'm going to save formatting the actual time for last because I think that is the most complicated part of this project. Let's move on to some of these other buttons, right? So we want to be able to reset our application back to the start of the, the start state, okay? So on that reset button, let's pretend that there is a function we can call called reset. I'll say on click, we'll call a function called reset. And I'll scroll up here and I will make a new function called reset. So let's just go ahead and do that. Let's think for a second. What does this reset button actually need to do? Well, it needs to basically reset the elapsed time back to 0. I could do that. We need to set the state of the application back to state of new. And then start time, technically we could just keep it as is because we restart it once we click start again. I think that's all we really need to do. So if I start it and then I click reset, notice that the start actually went back, but the timer is still running. So we have a little bug that we need to fix. Luckily in JavaScript, we can keep track of this interval, right? So the issue is we need to stop the interval when someone clicks reset. So let's keep track of the interval when we make it. So I'm going to say let interval equal to a number as well. And I'm just going to keep track of that. So when we click on the start button, we are going to keep track of the interval. And then when someone clicks reset, we're going to say clear interval and pass it that interval ID. So this is just a arbitrary number that represents the interval that's running. I think it's just a unique ID, and you can call clear interval down here to basically stop your timer from working. Now, don't worry about saying undefined here. Again, we're going to format this later on using a Svelte computed. But now if I click on the start button here and I click on reset, notice that it goes right back to 0. In fact, we could probably fix that undefined when the app loads by simply initializing this to 0 as well. And maybe that one, elapsed time, could be 0 as well. All right, so let's move on to the pause function. This one's going to be a little bit more interesting to create. So down here on pause, we're going to say onClick and invoke a function called pause, which we haven't yet created. So I'm going to go ahead and create one. So const of pause is equal to a function. Now this one is basically going to set some type of Boolean, or in this case, set our state variable to a different state. So we could say state is equal to state of paused. Now, if I were to show you this, there's going to be a bug, but let's just go ahead and walk through it slowly. When I click pause, notice that the buttons change. We see reset and resume, but the timer is still running. And this is not what we want. So what we could do is we could, inside of our interval, basically only run this logic here if we are in a state of running. I'm going to go ahead and wrap that in if statement. Say if state dot, or if state is equal to state of running, and we could just go ahead and wrap all that. So now when I stop it and then I pause it, the interval stops invoking. Well, technically the interval is still firing, but the if statement inside the interval is preventing anything from being updated. And then when I click resume, it's not going to do anything because we haven't implemented that yet. So let's just go ahead and go back to that last button called resume, and let's try to implement that. So on the resume button, I'm going to say onClick. We are going to invoke a function called resume. Again, we haven't declared resume yet, so let's go up to the top and say const resume is equal to a function. And again, we're going to set the state equal to state of running. And that should allow our interval to keep on firing and executing its logic. But there is an issue with this again. So let's just go ahead and look at it. If I click start, I click pause at 1200, and I'll just wait a little bit. Now, when I click resume, notice that the timer is going to jump a huge amount. So I click resume, it's already at 10,000. It was at 1 second before, now it's at 10 seconds. So that's a huge bug. Let's try to figure out how to fix that. So the reason that is happening is because our start time is stuck back at when we first clicked that start button. But when you pause and then you click resume again, we need to update that start time. So we could first go here. So when you click resume, we could basically set the start time equal to now. And then that will kind of change the logic a little bit. Let me just show you, there's still going to be a bug. If I pause it and then I resume it again, notice that it starts the timer back at 0. So what we need to do is we need to keep track of the old elapsed time and add it to our new elapsed time, basically. So here I could say let old elapsed time, let that be a number equal to 0. And down here instead on line 20, what we could say is elapsed time is equal to the difference between these added to the old elapsed time. But what we need to do is make sure we set this the moment we click on pause, or sorry, resume. Wait. Yeah, so the issue here is that we haven't yet set this anywhere. So the moment you click on that pause button, you want to make sure you set the old elapsed time to the current elapsed time. And this is probably the most complicated logic about this stopwatch timer. If you can think of a better way to do this, be sure to leave me a comment below. I'm interested in hearing your solutions. So now if I click on start, I click pause, wait a little bit, click resume, wait a little bit, click it again, you'll notice that the stopwatch is working exactly how we want it to work. So I think we made a lot of great progress. Let's go ahead and move on to the last step, which is formatting these milliseconds to look like a real stopwatch timer. So if you've ever dealt with building a stopwatch before, there's a lot of stuff called modulus and division to kind of figure out the different parts of what time has been elapsed. And that's what we're going to try to do here. But we can do it using Svelte computeds. So we're going to make a computed by using this money symbol and then a colon. And we can declare a new computed variable. So I could say millis for like milliseconds. And that could be equal to the elapsed time modded by 1000. Okay, so now what we could do in Svelte is we can actually display that in our template by just doing typical string interpolation. So if I do that, notice that when I start it, it's actually only showing me up to 1,000 max. This is the millisecond count that we're kind of interested in. To take that a little bit further, we can yet have another computed called formatted elapsed time. And that is going to be equal to a interpolated string where we print out millis and append a dot in front of that. Okay, so you can compose computeds with other computeds in Svelte. It's really, really awesome. I meant to do an equal sign there. So let's go back down to where we're kind of printing that out, and I will just print out that interpolated formatted elapsed time. And now when I start it, you'll notice that it shows the milliseconds. So let's kind of do the seconds, the minutes, and the hours. So to do the seconds, we basically need to take the elapsed time, and we need to first divide it by 1,000, and then we can mod it by 60, okay? Now this is kind of, I'm not gonna kind of go into too much detail why this works, but basically we truncate all the milliseconds off of our time, and then we just figure out the remaining like seconds that are in our elapsed time. So we can use this and basically display it here. And now when we start it, notice that after a second goes by, it's incrementing our timer. So let's move on to the minutes. It's very similar. We do minutes is equal to elapsed time divided by 1,000 times 60. And then we have to mod it by 60. All right, so let's go ahead and display that. We will say display the minutes with a colon between the seconds and the minutes. And notice that there's an issue. The issue is that there's a lot of extra decimals because we're doing like either double or floating point math. So we actually want to floor the results of all these. So if I go here, I can say math of floor, and we could just pass it basically, we'll just pass that one in. So now when I start it shouldn't necessarily do that. It's still doing it for the seconds. Anytime you're doing division, make sure you do the math.floor on the thing that you're trying to compute. All right, the issue here is because I actually need to divide by 60. I meant to wrap the 1,000 times 60, but I did not do that properly. So let me fix that. Okay. So I'm going to wait for a full minute to make sure this is working, but I will cut out the time that's elapsed in this video. All right, so while that's running, let's just go ahead and do the hours as well. And we basically are going to follow a very similar approach where we take the elapsed time divided by 1,000, divided by 60, and then divided by 60 once more, and then mod it by 60. And we can take that hours and display it over here in the front of everything. And now, let's wait for us to get to a minute before we refresh the page. Boom, there we go. Oops, I woke my child up. All right, so now we are displaying the minutes. So that's all working exactly how we want it. Now, if we save this, we are displaying the hours here, the minutes, the seconds, and the milliseconds. So we almost have a fully functional stopwatch. Now, the last finishing touches I want to put on the stopwatch is to kind of pad these times with leading zeros. So I'm going to make a function called pad2, and that is going to be a function that takes in a number. So I will say number of a number, and that is going to return basically a string concatenated with the number passed in, and then we are going to slice off 2 from the end. And that is how you basically do a quick hack to pad something. So what I could do is for the hours and the minutes and the seconds, we want to pad the results of all this by 2 so that when it prints out, it actually looks nice. Okay. Now for the milliseconds, notice that when we pause it on a lower number, I could get it, let's see. Right there. So I pause it on 85. We want to have a trailing or a leading 0. So we can add another function called pad3. We just simply add another 0 and we slice 3 off the end. And then I could just wrap this whole thing in pad3. Save it. And there we have it. We have a fully functioning stopwatch timer using Svelte and using TailwindCSS to style it. And I hope this tutorial was pretty awesome. I hope you guys learned a lot from it. If you're new to this channel, be sure to click that subscribe button, give me a thumbs up because it really helps my channel grow. And then secondly, if you want to see more applications like this built with Svelte and TailwindCSS, be sure to stick around and click that bell icon because I'm going to be publishing more in the future. All right, have a great day, y'all, and happy coding.